So 3 weeks ago, the Sutta class, I started off with the Mahanidana Sutra, which is about dependent origination. It is a long sutta, but I realized at the time it's very easy to split this into two parts. And to remind you, when I told Ajahn Brahm I was going to do this, he wished me the best of luck because it's one of the toughest suttas to read out. But also it's a case that why not read it out so you get an understanding that some of these teachings of the Buddha are very, very profound and other ones are quite simple, but nevertheless hopefully we can get quite a bit out of this. And I was asked just to quickly go over what has happened before when we're talking about the links of dependent origination. In this version, in the DN15, it works backwards, but it's nice to work it forward as well, that we have the two qualities, the consciousnesses and the mentality-materiality, and the consciousnesses are the six sense consciousnesses: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching and knowing. And as for want of a better way of describing it, it's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty okay, that the mentality, materiality are like the objects of those consciousnesses. And we have the fact that those two are dependent upon one another. Without consciousnesses, there cannot be any objects of consciousnesses. And also without an object of consciousnesses, there can't be any one of the six types of consciousness. And the Buddha gave the simile like two sheaves of reeds. Resting on one another, you take one off and the other one disappears. That particular idea is important to the Buddha's philosophy of non-self because it was proving very powerfully that consciousness is not always there. It's not an eternal quality. That when the objects of consciousness disappear, so does the consciousness disappear as well. When there's nothing to know, the mind turns off. It's just not there anymore. It's not latent, it's just not there. So those two were going together. And then from there it was going on, quite interestingly, not mentioning the sense basis, which comes in other versions of dependent originations, but going straight to this quality which we call contact. It's the beginning of sensory experience. Now, the life as we know it, life is experienced as a sense experience. And that's also including the mind, the knowing, the hearing. The beginning of that is the contact, and from that we get the experience itself. And that experience, sensory experience, the act of seeing, hearing, knowing, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling in the body, or knowing, each one of those experiences is always either pleasant, unpleasant, or in between. That's just one way of categorizing what is essentially just experience. And once you understand this is experience, this is actually life. From those consciousness, objects of consciousness, we get experience. And from that, from this thing they call Vedana, what we experience, what we feel, from that often we can get what's called a craving. The craving, the wanting to have more experience. And I mentioned last week that the craving is the same word in Pali for thirst, which gives it something you can really get your head around. When you're really, really parched, you have a very dry, hot day, you really need some water or a cup of tea, you're thirsty, especially with a biscuit inside of it. So that's craving, thirst. And then from that, we get this thing we call fuel. Now, what we're talking about here is actually just how this whole process, without a sense of self, without something always being there, continues on throughout this life and through into a future life. We're talking about what drives the process of life forward. So we've got what life actually is this experience. What drives it forward is this fuel. Just like your car needs the fuel, the petrol, gas to move it forward. And it's from this craving we get this fuel. Craving creates this force, this energy, which pushes us forward into other places in this life and also into future lives. And we have this thing called existence, or states of existence, bhava. And one of the similes, not in this sutta, but from other parts of the sutta, a very famous simile, he said, like, consciousness is the seed, and your karma is the field. So imagine a consciousness going like a seed, falling onto a field, and the craving, that is the sap, the juice, which forces that consciousness to develop there. And that's a whole process. That's what the Buddha called the process of existence, bhava, sort of a dynamic process. And from that bhava, it actually becomes states of existence, places where your consciousness can develop and grow. In this world, you're at the Buddhist society. Your consciousness has come to this Buddhist society, and the craving, the karma is good. So actually you grow in this place. This is where your mind pushes itself and learns how to grow and mature. But it's not just even in this world, it's even in future worlds as well. And this is one of the interesting parts, which I always find fascinating as an ex-scientist, is that you can actually create these states of existence, because of craving and the fuel, and especially in your future lives. And certainly in the future lives, after you die, this whole process of fuel, the craving, your car hasn't run out of gas when you die. Your body has, but not the other part of you. So you continue, your momentum of existence continues on into another life. What life is what your craving actually creates? It fuels another type of life. And that's the interesting area for me, which when we have ghosts, heavenly beings, which, I'm sorry to say, but they do exist. These are beings. And what is those heavenly realms, those ghost realms? They're even how the Buddha says in the sutras, they're manomaya kaya. They're mind-made realms. You make them, you create them. And certainly in a ghost realm, in a heavenly realm, you make that realm. You've got a huge amount of power to create the realm where you think you belong, what you think you deserve. And that's certainly the case in those heaven realms and hell realms. That, there's not a hell realm down there waiting for you, like sometimes they used to say in Christianity. You create your hell realm, literally. What you think you deserve, what you crave because of the power of guilt. And you stay there as long as you think you deserve to be there. And the same as the heaven realms. You create, you manufacture those joyful realms. And I know that's the case because in deep meditation, it's amazing just what you can create. With nimittas in deep meditation, you understand how powerful this mind is. But what was also fascinating to me, how much of this life are you creating? And how much is actually out there, which you just have to endure? And how much of this world are you creating? And, I always, the longer I grow and meditate, the more I think this is amazing just how much we are creating the world around us. We're not victims. We're culprits. We're actually creating this. So anyway, that is, and then from that creating the world, we take rebirth. And of course, from the rebirth, as you all know, then you're stuffed. You've got to go through this all over again. Going to school, going to university, going out with girls and boys, getting married, having kids, being president of the Buddhist Society of West Australia. Don't do it again, Drew. Being spiritual director, one lifetime's enough. Okay, so this is our problem. That's dependent origination in a nutshell. And in each one of these, I did point out last week, And it's important because I've seen just somehow some creative Buddhist teachers, sometimes they want to interpret this in a new way. Now, remember, if you interpret things in a new way, you get a lot of attention, especially if you're in academia. If you just revisit what everybody already knows, it's not groundbreaking. So there's always a tendency, especially in Western Buddhism, to try and find a new angle on things. And when they try and find a new angle, trying to think, well, this can be actually just relating just one mind moment. And unfortunately, as I said here last week, the definitions of the Buddha don't allow for that. And just in the top of the page 5, where it says, if the stream of consciousness of a young boy or girl were to become, if after descending into the mother's womb, the stream of consciousness were to depart, it actually shows this is birth into the different classes of beings. This is the stream of consciousnesses going into a new life. It has specifically mentions a process of rebirth. This is actually how it happens. And I did not mention that when I try and teach rebirth, especially to scientists, the sticking point is, yes, okay, there may be people who remember their past lives, but how does that happen? How does a memory sort of go from one life to another? How does the process occur? And this, to me, was what dependent origination's purpose was, to actually define and explain the process of rebirth, how it happens, and why it happens. So that, to me, was the purpose over here. And to that, I did actually go a little bit further on descriptions of one essential self, but I want to finish off and just ask any questions just on the summary down to the middle of page 5 to the end of the paragraph on consciousness. Yeah, go on.
I think I get what you're trying to say. I mean, if it's the heavenly or hellish beyond, that entire experience is created by just the mind. Okay, there may be other perceived being, but that really is just virtual being. But what about this?
This one, and this is fascinating. I mean, of course, we don't know. Whenever you see the colour blue, am I seeing the same thing as the colour you're saying, or is this a socially agreed norm that that's blue? But what I'm seeing or what you're seeing, is it the same? How do we know? We can't prove that. And sometimes that, we have this teaching, this training, to make us see this world in one particular way. And I think I mentioned 3 weeks ago, one of the fortunate experiences I had was to spend 9 years in a society which had never been colonized by the West. And it was a separate society. And so I could see they created a world which was different than the world where I grew up in many fundamental ways. And it was similar, but it was very different. And from that, I sometimes wonder, indigenous communities which have grown up in isolation in some rainforest, isolated from other communities. And sometimes their language is a window into how they see the world. And some people, they just see the world in a totally different way than us. They actually live in a different world, you might say. Somebody was saying that there's some community up in the Amazon where they usually live, which didn't have any concept of future and past. And there's sometimes it doesn't exist for them, it's a different world. So the assumption that we all live in the same place is an assumption which, again, through quantum physics, we just say, do we? Or do we just intersect our worlds and we agree on certain things? And then sometimes then we get into some things where people see the world in a totally different way than what's agreed upon. Schizophrenics. Which world is true? Challenging. It is incredibly challenging, because I'm challenging just some of the basic assumptions of our world.
I've been taught, to survive here, there's an objective reality.
Exactly.
And the schizophrenics are just
Yeah. But maybe we're the schizophrenics and the other ones are the sane people. It's just there's more of us than there is of them. Okay, now this is, obviously I don't believe in this, but I'm doing this to challenge no one's perceptions of this world outside. And how much do we create? Here we go. Old Rupert Sheldrake. He was noticing, he's a great professor, he's one a real scientist who challenges everything. He was wondering about just the creation of crystals. Now, crystals, it seems to be that some of these very rare crystals, once it's created in one lab, it's easy to create it in another lab, in another part of the world. Before then, it was so difficult to create the crystals. He called it morphogenic resonance, I remember. Now this was actually weird. Did actually human beings create that? And then it happened. And in any physicist here, the Large Hadron Collider, which so-called discovered the Higgs boson, was a Higgs boson there before? Or did thousands of theoretical physicists create that? Did they make it happen? Did they create that world? Now, there's a strong argument to say it wasn't there before to be discovered. But once they wanted to find it, that craving created it. It's a fascinating angle. I won't go too long because I can go all day on this one. But yeah, Chris.
Is consciousness different from awareness, particularly
Yeah.
at the point where there's a transition when you're dying and being reborn? Is there a sort of state of consciousness that is there some place that is awareness different from consciousness? You're very clearly saying consciousness itself transitory.
Now, first of all, I did say, and this is an important point, consciousnesses. Making it plural, again, changes the ball game. And just one coming in, the other one totally vanishing, another one coming in, another one vanishing. So the awareness is usually what we call the mind consciousness. It's part of its function. It knows.
What about knowing?
Now this is where understanding one consciousness comes up and then another consciousness follows it. It's giving it a chronological sequence. You don't know something, you don't know that you know that you knew. So a mind object comes up, and then that becomes the object for the next consciousness. So, go.
What about if you go beyond before the arising of thinking and that sort of stuff? So, except what you say about knowing. But that's conceptual. I'm talking here about experience and knowing, precognitive. Okay, precognitive, where there is no grasping onto or pushing away of experience. The knowing of that, the hanging into that space, is that awareness?
No, that is still time lapse. Even though you know just the nature of this human body. When I hear you, your sound has already got into my ears, and was it a quarter of a second or something before it registers in my mind? There's always a lapsing there. And when we actually do the chronology of consciousnesses, its flow in time, that's where you can answer people like Descartes, I think, therefore I am. No, that's not true. You thought, therefore now you think that you are. Time lapse.
So what's the bhavanga?
There is no such thing as bhavanga.
Okay.
That is coming from commentary, Abhidharma. It's never part of the Buddha's teachings.
Thank you.
And it is not just an interesting addition. It's actually very important. It's very, what I call even malicious. Because the bhavanga gives an idea of this permanent place where consciousness can actually rest when it's not active. And it actually goes pretty much against the Buddha's teachings. So it's not just only not mentioned by the Buddha, nowhere in the suttas is that mentioned by the Buddha, but it's also is contradictory. We'll come across this in a few moments, because after the description of dependent origination, now we get into some of the teachings of anatta, of non-self. These two actually go together. We're trying to see, what is this thing called experience? Is there an experiencer? Or is it just this flow of consciousness, this process of consciousness, including time? And here we go, some more arguments. But there's always this tendency amongst human beings, always to try and find what I call an ultimate retirement home for the self. A place like a bhavanga, a place like an original mind, a place like a ground of all being, where one can hang out and exist beyond suffering.
Like the Hindus.
Precisely. That's the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism, basically. But many Buddhists are Hindus. Okay, because of the beliefs. So now we actually go into today's stuff. And I'm going to start, I think I did some of this before, but we have enough time here. Descriptions of one's essential self, the atta. Now, this is my translation. It's different than other translations, but it's valid. When I say one's essential self, I mean the idea of like a soul, who am I? Not the outside which changes, but the essential me. And that is pretty much what atta means in Pali. It's like the essence. It's actually sometimes it's like ness. Like you have Dhamma, and Dhammatta is Dhamma-ness. Like a happy and happiness, and sadness. It's that quality which is trying to get to the heart of these other qualities of life. It's you-ness, basically, the essence of you. And so, we have descriptions of one's essential self. Here we go, number 23. In what ways, Ananda, does one describing one's essential self describe it? So someone who thinks they exist, they've got an essential self, how do they describe it? So in this particular case, they say it's either got material form and limited, it's stuff. And limited, it doesn't mean just in space, it means in time as well. You exist, but only for a certain amount of time. One describes it thus: my essential self has material form and, it's limited, I did that. Or describing one's essential self as having material form and without boundary, one describes it thus: my essential self as material form and is without boundary. Now sometimes you might read the expression infinite, which is nice, but I want to take away that sort of the other ideas of infinite. It literally means not without an edge, without a boundary, in any particular way. Or describing one's essential self as immaterial and limited, one describes it thus: my essential self is immaterial and limited. Or describing one's essential self as immaterial and without boundary, one describes it thus: my essential self is immaterial and without boundary. So it's stuff, or it's just immaterial, it's limited, or it's boundless. Therein, Ananda, 24, one who describes one's essential self as having material form and is limited, either describes such an essential self as existing only in the present. Actually, this last week, this is a retranslation from last week, because I only got so far in actually retranslating it. So, the essential self is only existing in the present, or it describes it thus: such an essential self as existing only in the future. In other words, you're going to practice and train to realize that essential self sometime in the future, the enlightenment, the release experience. Yeah, go on. Don't say anything about the past here, because again, the past, for this particular case, this is it. Maybe you think that maybe my essential self was pure in the past and that's got defiled. I've got to return to that past. That's an interesting point there, because that original mind sort of thing would actually be referring to something in the past. That originally we had a pure mind, and somehow or other it's corrupted and defiled, and our job is to return to that sort of halcyon days of a pure enlightened mind. Yeah, again. Similar to that, yes. But anyway, it's not mentioned that here. Okay. Or that which is not thus, I will make thus. In other words, to develop the mind to be thus. This being so, it can be said, a settled view of one's essential self as having material form and limited underlies this. I'm going to go through quickly through this because then it goes through all of the other permutations as material or immaterial, with boundary or without boundary. And in each one he either describes, or one describes this as now, existing now, or describes it one time in the future, I'll get there, or says, if it's not right now, not like this now, I will make it like this by developing. And in each particular case, one can say that a settled view of one's essential self as either having material form or not material form, with boundary or without boundary, underlies all this. And now we go, as always in Buddhism, which sometimes for people without patience, why do you have to go through every description, every permutation? In what ways, Ananda, does one not describing one's essential self not describe it? Not describing one's essential self as having material form or immaterial form, limited without boundaries, one does not describe it thus. Okay, that's pretty obvious. So it's in these ways, Ananda, the one describing or not describing one's essential self does not describe it. That's 25 and 26, putting it just all together. So always mentioning here, in brief, in summary, if there is an essential self, it's either a thing, or like stuff, or it is immaterial. Is it with boundary or without boundary? Anyway, that's what the Buddha said. Next comes a bit more, instead of descriptions, considerations. Oh, sorry, you got something there.
With that non-description of one's essential self, is that implying that, let me see, how does it say? Not describing one's essential self as having material form, immaterial, etc., etc. Does that imply that you are describing your essential self as something different from all of that, or that you're just not describing it?
It's just not describing it at all.
Okay, thank you.
Because, again, this is just how a person would describe it. But it is, more importantly, is how you consider it, which is coming up next. And in what ways, Ananda, does one consider the concept of one's essential self? This is the idea of it, rather than just trying to sort of describe it, how it feels, how it experiences it. One considers sensory experience as one's essential self. To be is to feel, is to exist, is to have experience. Claiming sensory experience is my essential self. So it's not just I think, therefore I know. So I think, therefore I am. It's I feel, therefore I am. Or one considers, going through the three possibilities here, sensory experience is not my essential self. My essential self, the heart of me, doesn't have experience at all. It's something beyond experience. Heard that one before? Or you consider, sensory experience is not my essential self, but my essential self is not without sensory experience. My essential self possesses sensory experience, for my essential self is subject to sensory experience. And one of the similes the Buddha said here, to make this a little bit more clear, it's like a flower having a scent. So the flower can exist without a scent. But the flower can have a scent. So essential self can have experience, but doesn't need to have experience. Okay. Can have, but doesn't need to. There in Ananda, and then the Buddha takes each of these three apart. So he said there's not really any other way you can say experience is anything to do with the self. But anyway, these particular arguments, the Buddha was saying that anyone who thinks like to think, therefore I am, to know, to smell, therefore I am. Therefore, Ananda, the one who says sensory experience is my essential self, should be asked, friend, there are these three kinds of sensory experience: pleasant, painful, and neutral. That's neither pleasant, neither painful nor pleasant. I don't know why people keep calling it neither painful nor pleasant. If ever you're typing it out, that takes forever. Neutral is much faster, especially if you only type with 2 fingers. Of these three kinds of sensory experience, which do you consider your essential self? Now, this is not just a small thing, because a lot of time, if you are in pain and you're suffering, you always think, oh, that's not the real me. But if you're having a good time, if you're happy, this is the real me, this is at last I've made it. The essential self, in fact, if you look at this essential self, a being, it has to be happy. Otherwise, what's the point of living forever if it's suffering? That would be... Imagine if you find your essential self, your soul, and eventually when the soul, the self, gets released from everything else, you find the self is pure suffering for eternity. That would suck, wouldn't it? Big time. But anyway, this is the Buddha's thing here. Heaven always has to be fun. Enlightenment has to be bliss. The ground of all being has to be just so delightful. Otherwise, what's the point? The ground of all being, and you're trodden on all day and all night. Would that be a nice place to end up after all this hard work? Anyway, let's go back to what it says here. So, one who says sensory experience is my essential self should be asked, friend, there are three kinds of sensory experience: pleasant, painful, and neutral. Of these three kinds of sensory experience, which one do you consider as your essential self? Because on the occasion where one's sensory experience is pleasant, one's experience cannot be painful or neutral. On the occasion when one's sensory experience is painful, it cannot be pleasant or neutral. On the occasion when it's neutral, it cannot be pleasant or painful. It's either one and not the others. It changes, impermanent, mutates. So which one is the real you? So it says, Ananda, pleasant sensory experience is impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen, subject to destruction, falling away, fading away, and ceasing. Painful sensory experience is the same, impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen, subject to destruction, falling away, fading away, and ceasing. And neutral feeling is impermanent, conditioned, dependently arisen, subject to destruction, falling away, fading, and ceasing. If when one's sensory experience is pleasant, one assumes, yes, this is my essential self, I'm feeling myself today. Sometimes people say. Then with the ceasing of that pleasant sensory experience, one must conclude, my essential self has disappeared. I wonder where it's gone. If when one's sensory experience is painful, one assumes this is my essential self, if anyone would do that, then with the ceasing of the painful experience, one must conclude my essential self has disappeared. If when one's sensory experience is neither painful nor pleasant, neutral, one assumes this is my essential self, then with the ceasing of that neutral sensory experience, one must conclude my essential self has disappeared. And that is a contradiction. Essential self has to be essential, always there. That's the whole point of being essential. Always there, permanent. The place where you can hang up your head and retire forever, happy ever after. Yeah.
With your essential self, it's like there can be, for me, a feeling of essence that is me that I recognise as me. However, you can also feel that pain, feel neutral, but you can, for me, feel still that in-depth essence as such.
Now, first of all, this is why I call it essential self, because we have all other shells of self. The woman, the monk, the spiritual dictator, spiritual director. All these little selves are on the outside. We want to get the essence, underneath all of that. The heart, the thing which is stable, always there. The heart of the matter. And of course, that sort of thing has to be always there.
But can it not always be there, even though you are feeling the pain or feeling neutral
So
or feeling
he was
happy.
saying, that essence, is it the same as those experiences of pain and happiness? Okay, that's not this one. This first one is people identify that happiness, that feeling with their essential self. This is the first one. The second one is that my essential self is way beyond feeling. It's there, and just the thing, this is coming the second one. And the third one, it's that essential self. Yeah, it can feel when it wants to, but it doesn't have to feel. Now, those are the three possibilities. So, you're talking about the second one, which is coming soon. So, hang on and listen. So the thing is here, that first one, you cannot identify experience as one's essential self. Because experience changes. An essential self has to always be there. Can't just disappear. So, no, I got lost now, where am I gone? You will is my essential self. Okay, thus one who says sensory experience is my essential self considers their essential self something which even here and now is impermanent, a mixture of pleasure and pain, subject to appearing and disappearing. Therefore, now, because of this, it is not acceptable to claim sensory experience is my essential self. So, now we go to the next one. Ananda, then one who says sensory experience is not my essential self. My essential self is insentient. It's beyond feeling. They should be asked, friend, when there is no sensory experience, then at all, could even the idea I am occur there? How would you know without sensory experience? So the only way you can actually get hold of that essential self is through experiencing it. And if you say it doesn't experience anything, you can't know it.
Is that the same as thinking as well, like I am? Okay, no external, in meditation, switched off to external sensory input. I am, is that what you're talking about here?
No, because here, even there, the I am is experienced through the sense of the sixth sense, through the mind sense. But if the mind sense is not working either, if all those six senses are stopped, then of course you can't even know anything. You can't even know an essential self. Nothing to know it with. Even a thought, even that I am, can't be there.
Yeah, but there's a thing in the mind, deep in the mind, where you can
We're talking
experience without thinking.
Oh, yeah, not thinking. Thinking is one aspect of the mind. Mind can exist without thinking. We're talking about mind consciousness totally stopped. Knowing has gone. Not just thinking has stopped, knowing has gone as well.
So we're talking about just we're talking about momentary. What?
We're talking about just disconnecting the idea of a self, an essential self, a heart, an atta, a soul, in the deepest sense, from sensory experience. So if the idea that essentially you doesn't experience through any of the six senses, including knowing, then it becomes untenable. You can't even know it. So if the essential self was insentient, elsewhere the Buddha said it was just like a log in the ground. You can kick it. Is that an essential self, just like a log, a stone, which doesn't feel, doesn't experience? Is that who you are? And the whole idea that thinking your essential self, the heart of you, is a log of wood, or like a stone, doesn't feel, again, it's untenable. The Buddha here is doing the old logical reductio ad absurdum. Say, well, if this is this, and this is where we end up with an essential self which doesn't make any sense.
Bhante, when you actually do practice the meditation of awareness of knowing,
Yeah.
okay, if you go into a deep following of that and sit maybe for quite a long time in that,
Yeah, of course.
there is complete dissolution of experience, of your sense of self, and basically it's like facing death.
Yeah.
There's just nothing, and there's not even a word to describe it.
Yeah,
And it's very, very scary.
that is subverbal, but it's not complete. This is one of the problems. Be careful, Chris, and everybody with meditation experiences. Because you get to one peak and you think that that's the top of the mountain range, but then something happens and you go to a peak much higher than that. If there's a knowing, it's not ended yet. It's not complete. It's a partially complete experience.
So how do you know that? How do you experience liberation?
Liberation is to understand that even this is subject to cessation, subject to disappearing. All that is subject to arising, all of that is subject to stopping completely. The aparisesa, without remainder, nibbana. Nothing remaining. This is why the Buddha's very powerful. Just saying, without remainder, nothing. But you know the old stories which I've been writing, we always like to make something out of nothing. So it's nothing there, nothing there. Oh, yes, I've experienced a nothing. I'm now merged with the great nothing. And nothing becomes another name for heaven. So be careful of that. Emptiness becomes a place where you can go and live the rest of your years. Rather than, it's empty, nothing there, okay, gone. Ah, yes, nothing, the great place.
Shunyata.
Yes, sunyata, yeah. Yeah?
Some people say they experience in meditation that when you think of, when you remember your past lives, that some stages they come to a dull state, they don't feel anything. Because then there's no sense, but they know there is no sense. So
sometimes you've got to be careful because people's knowledge and assumptions are not complete. That's one of the reasons why you know this, you've got somewhere, but not by your wisdom. Because a lot of times people's wisdom is bent to suit themselves. Now if you're talking about just, getting somewhere on the path, you know that more by your behavior, lack of anger, lack of lust, craving, lack of fear, not by your wisdom, because there's so many people who can go out there, say some very wise things. That doesn't make them enlightened. Because they say wise things, the next minute they're doing all sorts of crazy, stupid stuff. So be careful of just the idea of wisdom. Wisdom is important there, but if it really is, they think there's no self, then they'll have no craving, no ego, no wants. Be free, no fear. So anyway, be careful there, because the people are very dull. I think they don't exist. I think that's the new realm. I tell you, we create new realms called the zombie realm. We got the ghost realm, we got the Deva realms. Maybe there is now a zombie realm, because people have created it, because they wanted it. So it's only a joke, okay, it's not in the suttas. Okay, the last one is, again, much more interesting. Okay, 31. One who says sensory experience is not my essential self, but my essential self is not without sensory experience, and I gave the simile which is elsewhere, like the flower with a scent. My essential self is subject to sensory experience. He should be asked again, if sensory experience was to cease absolutely and utterly without remainder, which is again sort of the last of the meditation experiences, then in the complete absence of sensory experience, with the cessation of sensory experience. In other words, this essential self can sometimes have sensory experience. What happens if it stops totally? Then what does that do to your essential self? And again, just even the idea, I am, cannot occur there. So Buddha asked, could the idea, I am this, occur there? That I am this, you could actually know it. Certainly not, Venerable Sir. Therefore, Ananda, because of this, it is not acceptable to claim sensory experience is not my essential self, but my essential self is not without sensory experience. My essential self is subject to sensory experience. You can't say that. And this is, again, the result of actually really penetrating those arguments. Ananda, when one does not assume sensory experience as one's essential self, you aren't this experience. And you don't assume an essential self which is without sensory experience and insentient. And you do not assume my essential self is not the same as sensory experience, but subject to sensory experience. Then with those three places where people assume they exist, all gone, then being without such assumptions, you do not cling to anything in the world. The clinging, this was, I thought, my own insight. Because clinging, grasping, you use metaphors from real life. I look at myself, I'm always picking something up. I'm not picking this up, put it down again. Sometimes during talks, you fiddle with this and fiddle with that. And I thought, stop it. Stop clinging to things with your hand. I thought, I can't do that. That's what my hand does. It's its whole purpose and function is to cling, pick things up and put them down. That's what this is for. So I thought the only way I can get rid of clinging with my hand is to cut my hand off, amputate it. That if I haven't got a hand, only then will I stop clinging. And I thought, exactly, that is what's going on here. When you have an essential self, an idea of essential self, you'll always cling to something. Because that's what your essential self does. That's what its function, like a hand picks up things. And I was so pleased with the simile which I invented, until I read through the Samyutta Nikaya once and I found the simile of the hand by the Buddha. Exactly the same. And I thought, wow, where did the Buddha get that from? Did he get it from me? So of course he didn't. It must be some memory of a previous life teaching or something I got that one from. But that's the purpose of a hand, it picks things up. The purpose of an essential self is to cling. The only way you can stop clinging, get rid of your concept of an essential self. And then, as the Buddha says here, then, without those assumptions, you don't cling to anything in this world. Not clinging, not agitated. The whole idea of agitating, the mind always busy doing things, always wobbling. Nothing agitates you. You can actually get some peace now. Not being agitated, they attain extinguishment, nibbana. And of course, you know that where I get that translation from, when a flame goes out, it nibbanas. Candle goes out, it nibbanas. What's the English word for that? Extinguished. They understand destroyed is rebirth. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There's no returning to any state of existence. Dependent origination has been cut. And I know that sometimes in some circles I always say, where is dependent origination cut? And sometimes, they sometimes say between Vedana and craving, or craving and this. I say, oh, come on you guys, the Buddha never talked like that. The Buddha always said, when avijja, the delusion, is overcome, then dependent origination unravels. So this is when you see the main avijja, that in this particular case, identifying your essential self as experience or something which experiences, or even insentient, which is really the most illogical one. See that, avijja broken. Then you don't cling, don't pick up things. The hand is cut off. Then nibbana happens.
But then after what happens with consciousnesses?
They stop. All the consciousnesses, they've done their job, poof, disappear. The use-by date has expired.
So then how does a person who has to function in life function?
Oh yeah, I mean talking about when the enlightened being dies, passes away. When you're still functioning, that's a good question, which I say, well, if all your craving has gone, there's no sense of self anymore, how do you carry on? And if you're a layperson, this happens, you don't carry on. 7 days maximum, and you're dead. That's what it says in the commentaries. The Buddha never says that, it's in the commentaries. But I think, wow, that's actually pretty accurate. So if you get enlightened today, fully enlightened, you understand this totally, and so you no idea of a sense of self anymore, and you give up all clinging and become an arahat. You've only got 7 days left, mate. Because the whole thing which drives you forward in this life has been extinguished. The fuel has run out, you've run out of gas. So you've got to stop. Except if you become a monk or a nun, they said. And I would extend that. If you become like a committee member of the BSWA, you get an extension. The reason is because the purpose of your life, what drives you forward now, is not coming from a sense of an essential self anymore. It's coming from compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, equanimity, the 4 Brahma Viharas. Replace craving to keep you going until the end of your time.
Okay, so then what you're saying is that compassion, loving kindness takes over from the consciousnesses?
Craving. Yeah. It takes over from the craving, and the upadana, the fuel. The fuel becomes totally impersonal. Mm-hmm. Which means when you die, that dries up as well. So you're gone. So that is what drove the Buddha after his enlightenment. And again, if this Sahampati, who was one of the Buddha's old mates from the previous life, if he hadn't have come down and told the Buddha, please teach, then the Buddha would have just passed away. He just arose a seed of compassion in our Buddha and got him working. And once that seed of compassion was going, why teach? To create the 4-fold assembly. Monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. Once those 4 were established, great, done his job, now he can go.
And you're saying then that a person with an enlightenment and coming from compassion and loving kindness cannot possibly function in an everyday life layperson as such.
It's very difficult. Even I know a few people who've got some really great meditation, and they don't function like other people function. They're usually just in their rooms most of the day. Come out to eat, just don't watch TV or anything. Makes no sense to them.
Thank you.
So we have just gone through, all the possibility of the assumptions of the various possibility of the identification of an essential self. It seems as if it's purely through just a logical, didactic, philosophical thing. But is this really an exposition of the various clinical study whereby through practice this is the various pitfalls?
Yeah, exactly. Now that's a logical study, and you've all heard it, and it's been explained reasonably well, and you've understood it, so are you enlightened? Exactly, no. But what it's doing, it's pointing your mind into that area. And it takes years, to get into those areas and say, wow, it's actually pretty true. All those assumptions which you're making of me, of an essential self, you can actually, this is only one way of many ways, but you can actually see it in there. So that's what I'm up to. So what it does is actually it starts to give you some light into some of those areas which you may not have seen before, of where you assume you are. And little by little, you chip away that, especially in your meditation, until just you see it very clearly. There's nothing in there. Nothing.
But I think that you cannot go down that path
unless you have a corresponding increase in the experience of Brahma Viharas to take the place of the dissolution of the sense of self and the lack of reification of the sense of self.
That's an interesting one because
Because it holds, there's a natural grief, Bhante, as you get older, and I see it all the time professionally, that people really slowly wake up to the reality of life, and it's shocking, especially when you're cracking late 40s and 50s. And there's a grief that, you know, all the stuff that I put my money on with my sense of self is, my money, my body, whatever it might be. There's a disillusionment, and the reaction to that is grief. So grief is a major, major part of being alive. The Buddha said that. To actually be able to not be sunk by that and maintain awareness, one has to develop a sense of loving kindness towards oneself and others. Otherwise, people just actually go into hiding, dissociation, power trips, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
Well, being a monk, when you get into your 60s, you think, wow, what a great choice it was. Yeah, so, you know, I lose out in the early part of life. You know, you have all your fun and movies and music, and I lost out on all of that, but now I'm getting the payback. Yeah, no grief. But it is actually true, because you see sort of people get into the dissolution of a sense of self, and basically they don't know how to relate. So it is true that compassion and kindness is really powerful. There was a monk, I won't say who he is, some of you may know him, that I've known him for a long time, that he's still a good man. He's a Thai monk. The word was that he'd cracked it, become arahats. You know, we get to know all these things, you know, in the monks' gossip around tea time. And so I wasn't actually there at the time, but I was just a few kilometers away. And Ajahn Chah got to hear about this and had a meeting of many of the senior monks there in Thailand. And he went to the most senior of his disciples, because always go down in line, and said, you've been a monk, disciple so many years, have you got any defilements left? He said, oh yeah, I've got a few. The next one, what about you? Oh yeah. And he went down the line until he got to this monk. Have you got any defilements left? He said, no, none at all. And everyone went quiet. This guy, in front of Ajahn Chah and all his friends, was claiming to be fully enlightened Arahat. And so Ajahn Chah said, come upstairs. And so just the two of them went up to Ajahn Chah's private quarters to have a chat. And of course, everyone downstairs was dying to know what Ajahn Chah was telling this guy. But we found out afterwards, he said, right, now you've got to develop the Brahmaviharas. You've got to develop compassion. That's your job now. And that's exactly what you said. Otherwise, you basically disappear, disassociate, basically die. Yes? And please, no one ask me who that monk is, because I will not tell you.
My question was a discussion that Chris had about the Hindu place where the consciousness could rest.
Mm-hmm.
What was that called again?
There's a number of them.
Right.
Yeah.
So if that doesn't exist according to Buddhism, in relation to rebirth, does that mean that once you die, you're just an average layman like me, you basically then instantaneously move into another life? There's no gap of time like months or days or something between lives. You just switch between lives.
The answer is yes and no, because that became a controversy, which is a stupid argument when you understand the real picture of it. As soon as you die, you're still aware. So you do get reborn, if you want to call it that, into the intermediate realm. That's why there's so many stories, even just recently, I forgot who it was, their father or mother died, and they were at the end of the bed looking at them just recently, for a long time. Clear, just standing, just basically making sure you're all right. They were dead. When you die, you can actually go anywhere you like, check people out. You can go to the city of Stirling, find out what's really going on as a ghost. Now you can really have some idea.
But that you're talking minutes or hours. I'm talking, is there a possibility of
immediate rebirth?
Years.
Oh yeah, of course.
Between like years and years,
honestly,
decades.
Yeah, sometimes, predators, sometimes people can stick around for a long, long time, for years. I did, as a young man, that's one of the societies I joined, the Psychic Research Society, go investigating ghosts, reading all about ghosts, and these were not crazy people. These were professors. One of them came to our conference, Bernard Carr. He was one of those guys, professor of theoretical physics, student of Stephen Hawking's at Queen Mary College. He was into ghost hunting and figuring out exactly what are they. And some of these people have been around for a long, long time, many years, stuck in that realm, which a lot of it they create.
Isn't that a rebirth?
It is a rebirth, yeah.
Right. So when you die, you have to be reborn almost straight away, whether it's ghost or human or
exactly. And sometimes that intermediate realm is so similar to a ghost realm. If you stick in there for too long, you might as well call it a ghost rather than intermediate realm.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
So anyway, the next paragraph is again carries on here about what happens after death. Ananda, if anybody should say of a monk, same happens to a bhikkhuni or a layperson, whose mind has been thus liberated, that he holds the view, a Buddha, they call it Tathagata, a Buddha persists after death. Now I changed the usual translation from exists after death to persists, much more accurate according to the Pali, and it also means the continuation. That would not be proper to say persists after death. Or they hold the view a Buddha does not persist after death. That would not be proper. Or holds the view a Buddha both persists and does not persist after death. If you've ever been to India and got into a philosophical argument with Indians, you can understand how every combination, even if they don't understand what it means, is brought up into the argument. Or if you hold the view a Buddha neither persists nor does not persist after death, that would not be proper. So the idea, and it's not explained in this paragraph, but in other places of the sutras it's explained, you cannot say either of these things. And people say, well, what about the Buddha does not persist after death? Does that mean he exists after death? No, it doesn't persist after death. It's not saying that because a Buddha is not to be found now. It's just a process. So you can't say it exists after death. You can't say it persists after death. Or you can't say it doesn't persist after death, because there was nothing here to begin with, so it can't persist. For what reason? Because that monk is liberated by direct knowing this, the extent of designation and the extent of the pathway for designation, just how you can describe stuff, and also the fact that the idea somebody exists after death here assumed existing before death. The extent of language, the extent of the pathway for language, the extent of description, the pathway for description, the extent of wisdom and the sphere of wisdom, the extent of the round of rebirth and the extent to which the round turns. To say of a bhikkhu who is liberated by direct knowing this, that he holds this view, one does not know and does not see, that would also not be proper. Sometimes they say, that means you don't know anything, you haven't seen it. So the monk who has, or a layperson who has got enlightened, they do know and they do see, but they don't use such language of those four questions, because every one of those four questions, does a Buddha persist or not persist, always carries an assumption which they don't agree with to begin with. The old metaphor was, in logic, the question is, how often do you beat your wife? Once a week or once a month? This was a long time ago, okay. And so you can't say A or B. It's neither. I don't beat my wife. Because that question assumed that you beat your wife. Now, this is just don't worry about being sexist. This is an old historical question. And the point being here is it has an assumption behind the question, And you've only allowed, those two alternatives, and neither of them you can answer yes to. The same as each one of these 4 questions. Does the Buddha exist after death, doesn't exist after death, or persist after death? Both persist and not persist, neither persist nor not persist. Each one of those carries an assumption the Buddha exists now, before he died. And that's why they say the pathway of language does not allow an answer to that at all. And the answer is actually found in the Samyutta Nikaya by Venerable Sariputta. He was actually saying just about, the Buddha is just the bunch of the 5 khandhas. The 5 khandhas, is there a Buddha to be seen right now? What actually is the Buddha? In this particular case, he wasn't talking about experience. He said, is the Buddha sort of the body? Is he, actually did say experience. Is the experience, perception, the will, or the consciousnesses? Which one of those is the Buddha? He said, none of them are. That's just a process. So you can't see the Buddha now. How can you actually see a Buddha after they're dead? Or not see a Buddha? It does not exist even now. And of course, you all know, I've said last time about the simile of a flame. A flame doesn't really exist. It's just 3 things which come together. That's a pathway of designation, a flame. What is it again? The wax, the wick, and the heat. They come together, that's called a flame. That's a designation. That's a name. That's the pathway for language. And so, when one of those causes stops, then the flame is extinguished. So, does the flame exist after death? After being extinguished, does it not exist? Does it both exist and not exist, neither exist nor not exist? None of those questions make any sense, because they all come from an assumption there was a flame there to begin with, rather than 3 things coming together, a process. How's that? Shall we move on? Processes are great. Yeah, processes. Okay. Processes. Processes is many processes. Okay, I'm just messing with it. Okay. You got a question, yeah.
That last part of the paragraph, the extent of designation, the extent of the pathway of designation, etc., to the end. I mean, I can't make head or tail of that, I'm afraid.
Okay, I try to explain it. It's because the 4 questions were presented in a way which is an assumption. It's an error in the language, the error in the way it's formulated. The error in the...
Talking about the beginning of the paragraph. The Tathagata...
No, you're talking about the 4 positions. A Buddha persists after death, doesn't persist after death, both, and does not, neither, and does not neither, or whatever it is. Yeah. Those 4 ones. The language is not, is limited. Yeah. The designations are not accurate. So understanding that this whole 4 questions is not put in a useful, accurate, meaningful way means that Bhikkhu never says any of these. And when people say, oh, you just don't know anything, you do not see, the Buddha is saying, no, because that monk understands that whole 4 questions is put in the wrong way. Okay? Anyway, that's all you're getting, so let's move on. Now we go on to another little piece, again, having talked about the sense of self, now and this whole idea of states of existence in the dependent origination, places where the consciousness can actually find a footing and grow, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Now we have something which is quite unique here. There's 7 platforms for consciousness. It says the 7 stations of consciousness. I've used the word platform, especially in modern IT language, platforms on which you can put stuff. And so I thought platform was an interesting new translation for this term. And I love putting in these ideas. I don't know if it will actually, many of these translations, they will last, but you put them out there, and if they're really useful, then they will persist If they're not useful, just like Darwinian evolution, if they're not suitable, then they'll disappear again. So this is something I put out there, platform for consciousness. Ananda, there are 7 platforms for consciousnesses. Oh, I should have put an S there. And 2 bases. What are the 7? So this is where the streams of consciousness can take root. There are, Ananda, beings who are diverse in body and diverse in perception, such as human beings, some gods and some beings in the lower realms. That's the first platform where consciousnesses can find a footing. There are beings who are diverse in body but identical in perception, such as some of the gods of the Brahma order who are generated through the first jhana. I was always fascinated about how the jhana, if you really get into those jhanas, and just how that will create your rebirth. And just those beings there in the Brahma realm, they're just almost sort of totally out of this world, out of the sense world, but still lingering a little bit into it. This beautiful bliss of loving kindness, brilliant beings. And also those realms of highly compassionate beings. So always interested in the link between bliss and compassion, bliss and love. Because a lot of people always experience, or not a lot of people experience the deep blisses of meditation as pure love. It's just how they perceive the same experience. So, those incredible Brahma beings. So there are beings who are diverse in body but identical in perception, such as the gods of the Brahma realm who are generated the first jhana. This is the second platform for consciousness where beings get reborn. There are beings who are identical in body but diverse in perception, such as the gods of streaming radiance based on the second jhana. This is the third platform for consciousness. And again, going through all these different combinations. And such beings, identical in body, basically just mind-made body, not perceiving that body, but diverse in perception. That was always a difficult for one to me to really get. But what they were saying, and because the jhana is identical perception, this is diverse in perception, what the commentary was saying was something I really still haven't got my head around, that there's different levels of that second jhana. Because the second jhana, what they say in the commentary, there is the, what I call sometimes the 1.5 jhanas, where the vitaka stops. In other words, the mind does not go onto the object anymore, but the object is still not totally stable. That's the vichara. And this real second jhana is everything is totally still and stable. So I must admit that that's one place where I still haven't really penetrated what the Buddha's actually saying there, about how in the second jhana you can have beings who are diverse, who are identical in body but diverse in perception. To me, the perception will be the same. Maybe it's something I've got to learn there. That's the third platform for consciousness. But they call those the gods of the streaming radiance. That's second jhana a lot. That's where a person can get reborn into. There are beings who are identical in body and identical in perception, such as the gods of refulgent beauty, the third jhana. There's a fourth platform for consciousness where consciousness can actually stay and grow. There are beings who, through the complete surmounting of perceptions of material form, the passing away of perception of impingement, non-attention to perception of diversity, contemplating spaces without boundary, arrive at the base of unbounded space. This is the fifth platform for consciousness. And as many other people say, that's always based on the fourth jhana. Those immaterial realms are subsets of the fourth jhana. There's another subset of the fourth jhana which is mentioned in a minute. And the sixth, there are beings who, having completely surmounted the base of unbounded space, contemplating consciousnesses without boundary. Now, I should actually mention here that when it says it's without boundary, without definition, without limits, what's actually happening here is the thing is vanishing and disappearing. And the usual simile which I use, which I found helpful because people can get their head around it, is the idea of present moment awareness, which is a common experience in meditation. When you get into the present moment, you can understand that as time without any boundary. Because there is no past, there is no future in the present moment. Once you go in there, there's no boundary, nothing to define time, nothing to measure it with. To measure time, you need a future and a present, or you need a past and a present, or a past and a future. That's the only way you can actually measure it, you can define it. But when it's unbounded, unlimited, unmeasurable in the present moment, then it's like you have all the time in the world, but no time at all. And the whole concept of time is about to vanish. You've all probably been in those meditation states. You're really in the present moment, and you're perfectly aware. You don't know how many minutes have gone or hours have gone, but you're not asleep, you're not unconscious, you're perfectly right there. Time has lost its meaning. It's disappeared for you. Now, from that experience, you can get some idea of what it means, this unbounded or unmeasured space and unmeasured consciousness. Those two things are vanishing. So this is especially interesting. Consciousness is vanishing here. And those are beings, number 7. Completely surmounted the base of unbounded consciousness. Contemplating there's nothing. It's actually experiencing more like than contemplating. There is nothing less. Consciousness is, for you, has vanished. It's not there anymore, not in its normal state, but you're conscious of nothing. That is the base of nothingness. This is the 7th platform for consciousness. And now even nothing vanishes. Well, oh no, sorry, can't say that because that's not a platform of consciousness. That last place is just too refined for, that's neither perception or non-perception. Basically, the consciousness got nothing really, can't really hold on there. It's too fine. So the 7th is beings who have completely surmounted the base of unbounded consciousness and contemplated there is nothing, arrive at the base of nothingness. This is the 7th platform for consciousness. And now the 2 bases, the base of non-percipient beings, and that's the other set of the 4th jhana, is so incredibly still and equanimous that perception stops. Body but not perception. And the 2nd, the base of neither perception nor non-perception. These are 2 bases. So you can't really say that consciousness a station or a platform for consciousness, because basically consciousness is really not unstable, but just basically doesn't exist there. They're in Ananda. These are the places, like the cosmology of Buddhism, but it's saying it in terms of the consciousness creating these places. They're in Ananda. If one understands the first platform of consciousness, that of beings who are diverse in body and diverse in perception, if one understands its origin, its passing away, its satisfaction, its unsatisfactoriness, and the escape from it, is it proper to seek enjoyment in it? Certainly not, Venerable Sir. If one understands the remaining platforms for consciousness, and also the base of non-percipient beings and the base of neither perception nor non-perception, if one understands its origin, how it arises, how one day it will have to pass away, its satisfaction, its unsatisfactoriness, and the escape from it, is it proper to seek enjoyment in it? Certainly not, Venerable Sir. So this is getting away your craving even for these platforms for your consciousness where it can exist, which for many people are just totally bamboozled by. Get into a jhana, you can understand what these things are. Another, when a monk, layman, laywoman, nun, having understood as they really are the origin, passing away, satisfaction, unsatisfactoriness, and escape in regard to these 7 platforms of consciousness and 2 bases, they are liberated through non-clinging, and they are called a monk liberated by wisdom. So this is not clinging, not sort of having any interest in those very refined realms. So, when we look at a realm we can finally exist in, we say these are some incredibly refined realms. Platforms for your consciousness to persist in. Each one of these, you see origin, passing away, satisfaction, unsatisfactoriness and escape, and you don't want anything to do with them anymore. Now, with those places that consciousness can find a footing, there is also here the 8 liberations. And these 8 liberations are basically learning how to experience what these platforms of consciousness are before you ever get reborn in there. Basically, these are the meditation experiences. And the 8 liberations are all to do with the jhanas. And interestingly, they're called liberation, vimokkha. These are the vimokkhas. And it's close to enlightenment, but not enlightenment. And the first 2 are always the ones which people have a lot of trouble with, even me. So, and I just translated it this way because this is how I understand it. There are these 8 liberations. What are the 8? Number 1, one enters a jhana beginning with material forms. This is the first emancipation. One enters a jhana not based on material forms. This is the second emancipation or liberation. Now what does that actually mean is that basically the entering the jhana through something like, this is how the commentaries say it, and I'm not very happy with this. Unfortunately I'm not with the Buddha to find out exactly what he meant here. Doing like a jhana through contemplations of like a body part. And this is quite common for monks and meditators, nuns as well, to do. When they start contemplating their body, especially skeletons, I don't know why it is, but sometimes monks, nuns, they contemplate and say, I've got a skeleton in my room. Very old skeleton, very nice, and sometimes I loan it to monks to do meditation with. A real one. Sorry, it's just a skull, sorry, or the whole skeleton. And with that skull, it's sometimes you can visualize that, and it's because it shows you just who you really are. And because most people in the West are in their head, to see a skull, to focus on it, this is all I really am. And then eventually you can actually visualize it so strong, and because of the sense of dispassion which it arises towards sensory things, this is what you're going to end up as, just a bit of skull somewhere, if it's not burnt. And then after a while it gives us such dispassion, you become incredibly peaceful. And restlessness vanishes, and you can hold the image of that skull for long periods of time. Anything you hold for long periods of time, it starts to, your awareness, your mindfulness gets stronger, beautiful, and that skull starts to radiate. It becomes really incredibly beautiful. It becomes a nimitta. Beautiful nimitta, white usually, very powerful, very glowing, and it's such a pleasurable thing to be able to observe. You can very easily fall into that, and that becomes into a jhana. So a jhana using material things, as opposed to the jhanas using other forms of arousing nimitta, such as like the breath. So different ways of arousing jhana. That's actually what the commentary says, and that's really the best, and I think, why not? It makes sense there. Or, my more favorite one enters a jhana by focusing on the beautiful. This is a third emancipation. So, focusing on the beautiful. I've spent a lot of time in my career teaching meditation. Please do not have a fault-finding mind. Please, 2 bad bricks, look at the other bricks in the wall. Please, forgive, let go. Be grateful for the wonderful things you've done. Get rid of all the negative photographs in the photo album and just keep the beautiful photographs. That's what I said on Friday night. Developing that positive mind which can see the beauty in things. See the beauty in another human being. And I'm not talking about physical beauty, the beauty in people's hearts, in prisoners. See the beauty in your breath. See the beauty in your mind. You get a nimitta coming up, a light. See the most beautiful part of that nimitta, then the most beautiful part of that most beautiful part. Focusing on this beautiful aspect. And then that just arises so much joy, happiness, contentment, stillness as well in the mind, because you're satisfied, the mind doesn't go restlessly looking for something else. And that develops incredible powerful nimittas. Loving kindness is subsumed into the beautiful. It's a subset of the focusing on the beautiful, because loving kindness, compassion is just a beautiful object of meditation. So whatever is beautiful, to focus on that, that can actually lead you into a jhana. And now we go on to the next ones. Completely surmounting perceptions of things, or passing away of perceptions of impeachment, non-attention to perception diversity, contemplating spaces without boundary. We go through these, what before were platforms of consciousness, and this is experiences in meditation. This is the fourth emancipation, which is unbounded space. The fifth emancipation is unbounded consciousness. The sixth emancipation is the base of nothingness. The seventh emancipation is the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And now we have the eighth emancipation, not mentioned before, because consciousness cannot exist at all here. Having completely surmounted the base of neither perception nor non-perception, one enters and dwells in the cessation of perception and feeling, the cessation of experience, the cessation of consciousnesses. That's the eighth emancipation. And it does actually say somewhere else, if you have that experience of that eighth emancipation, really, and you know it because you've gone through the other ones, when you emerge, you're either a non-return or fully enlightened, no other alternative. Because you actually experience the ending of all consciousnesses. And Ananda, when one attains these 8 liberations in forward order, in reverse order, in both forward and reverse order, when one attains them and emerges them wherever one wants, in whatever way one wants, and for as long as one wants, and when through the destruction of the outflowings, one here and now enters and dwells in that liberation of mind, liberation by wisdom, having realized it for oneself with direct knowledge, then one is called a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni, a layman, laywoman, who is liberated in both ways. And Ananda, there is no other liberation in both ways higher or more sublime than this one. Thus spoke the enlightened one, the venerable Ananda, being pleased, rejoiced in the Blessed One's words. Now, before I do some questions from the internet and questions from you, I will just go back to the very beginning of this sutta, where to give you a reason why it is so complicated, and that was because on one occasion the blessed Buddha was living amongst the Kurus in a town named Kamasadhamma. There the Venerable Ananda approached the Buddha, paid homage to him, sat down to one side and said, "It is wonderful and marvellous, Venerable Sir, how this dependent origination is so profound and appears so deep, yet to me it seems as clear as can be." The Buddha was putting him in his place. This is deep, this is contemplated. And of course I can't resist my translation of the next paragraph. And the Buddha replied, "Steady on, old chap, steady on." Putting it in vernacular instead of enough. This dependent origination is profound and appears deep. Because of not understanding and not penetrating this Dhammananda, this generation has become entangled like a knotted ball of thread, like rushes and reeds all matted, so that few become free from the cycle of rebirth. So the Buddha was not pulling his punches here, was not trying to make it easy for Ananda, just going way into the deepest understandings of dependent origination, states of existence, nature of consciousnesses, understandings or assumptions, wrong assumptions of the state of self, and lastly just the whole cosmos where consciousnesses can actually exist. Okay, now let's get some questions from the computer then. Yeah?
Is there any difference between liberation by wisdom and liberation in both ways?
Ha ha ha. There is indeed 2 ways of liberation. The only difference is, in the liberation both ways, one has experience of the immaterial attainments. All liberations have to have the jhanas, but the other ones, which is unbounded space, unbounded consciousness, experience of absolute nothingness, or the neither perception nor non-perception, those define liberated in both ways. Okay, someone from Vietnam. Ajahn, if there is no self, how does karma follow us after death and rebirth if there is no self? Exactly, there's a process, and that process carries the seeds of what the cause was, and then that result carries the seed. In the same way, the old simile, I think I said it last time, a mango, you eat a mango now, you plant the seed, and that seed makes a new mango tree, you eat the new mango. What went across from the first mango to another mango? There's nothing in the first mango which is in the next mango from the new tree. But it's still a mango. It's not an apple from a mango seed. And if the last one was sweet, the new one was liable to be sweet. If the last tree, the first tree from which you got the seed was drought resistant, chances are the new one will be drought resistant. Something went across. Some characteristics. The karma goes across without something carrying it. So that is actually how rebirth happens without a self. This whole idea of dependent origination is that process. There's no self inside dependent origination, but you can see how the process moves forward, moment to moment to moment to moment, driven by craving, fueled by those desires, fueling on just like the tree, craving to push through the earth to meet the sun, moving towards the sun all the time. The similarities are quite interesting. From Poland, why should we want to be awakened and not reborn again? Is suffering better than nothing? No, reborn. Maybe having the opportunity to suffer is a chance to experience reality. If the reality is suffering, after a while, people get a bit fed up with suffering. So it says, why should we want to be free from a prison? Prison's not that bad. You get 3 or 4 good meals a day in a prison. You don't have to worry about your finances inside a prison. You know, you get sort of I think, get a little job here and there and just get enough. You can watch the TV in a prison. If you're on good behaviour, you can go and retreat any time. Just punch a prison officer on the nose, you can go on solitary confinement. Whatever. So some people actually like being in prison. They don't want to be free. They get time to go out of jail, they've been there 30, 40 years, they don't want to go. So is suffering better than nothing? When you realize what suffering is, then maybe there is an escape. But as soon as you think that you are there, there's someone experiencing the suffering or someone who's going to be destroyed and lose, that is the reason why people don't want to leave. Because they attach to suffering. They'd rather suffer and be than disappear and have the idea of not being anymore. The idea of existence is called bhavadanha, the craving to be. It's even more powerful than the craving for happiness. That's why sometimes people, you go and visit them in hospital, in the ICU. Actually not using the ICU because they're usually doled out with morphine. They're really suffering, but they can't let go of their body. They're afraid what might happen. They'd rather suffer and exist than maybe not exist without suffering. It's a craving to be, and it's terrible for me to see that. Is it not selfish to enter nirvana if you are compassionate? See, there's still so much suffering in this world. The Buddha entered nirvana because if he never entered nirvana, if he carried on, he would be the